Chapter 1: The First Seed. Before the pyramids. Before the Roman Empire. Even before the pharaohs. There was Mesopotamia. It was the first civilization in human history. And this is its story. This video will take you through the entire rise and fall of Mesopotamia, from the first villages to the last fallen empire. You'll hear about real kings who ruled thousands of years ago. About queens whose names were nearly erased. About wars, floods, betrayals, lost cities, and gods that once ruled human thought. You'll see how writing was invented. How cities were born. And how power, real, organized power, first took shape. But none of it would have happened without a single moment. One decision. One seed. Mesopotamia began with something small, so small that it could be held in one hand. A grain of wheat. A handful of barley. The first step was agriculture. 12,000 years ago, humans lived as hunter-gatherers. They moved with the seasons, searching for food, never staying in one place for too long. They hunted animals, picked wild plants, and lived in small groups. There were no towns, no permanent homes, and no leaders with real authority. But then something changed. Around 10,000 BCE, in the region that would later be called Mesopotamia, a group of people did something different. Instead of moving on, they stayed. They planted seeds near the rivers. They returned when the plants were ready. And soon, they realized something. If you stay in one place, you can grow more food. If you grow more food, you can support more people. And if you can support more people, you can build something bigger than just a family. You can build a society. Over time, more people settled along the rivers. The Tigris and the Euphrates provided water for crops. The soil was rich. Wild animals and fish were nearby. Life became more predictable. But staying in one place created new problems. When people began to store food, they needed protection. Crops could be stolen. Supplies could run out. Some years were harder than others. And when food became scarce, people started to compete. Someone had to decide how much food each family got. Someone had to protect the supplies. Someone had to lead. This is how power began. Not with a crown or a sword. But with food. The people who controlled the food became important. Some of them were good organizers. Others claimed to speak with the gods. And slowly, different roles began to appear: leaders, workers, warriors, priests. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was society. Villages turned into towns. Towns grew into cities. And with cities came new ideas: trade, temples, laws, myths, and monuments. The earliest known cities in the world appeared here, in Mesopotamia. Cities like Eridu, Uruk, and Ur were all born from this one transformation, from movement to settlement. From foraging to farming. And it all started with a seed. The first chapter of human civilization wasn't a battle. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't even a plan. It was a simple, practical decision. To stop moving. To plant. To stay. That choice would lead to everything that followed: writing, kingdoms, religion, war, art, science, and law. And while these early people could never have imagined it, they were beginning a chain reaction that would shape all of human history. In the next chapter, we'll enter the first true city, Uruk. And we'll meet a ruler whose story became the oldest known epic on Earth. Mesopotamia is just getting started. Chapter 2: Uruk, the city that shouldn't exist. Uruk was not the first place humans lived, but it was the first place they built something that looked like a civilization. It was a city so advanced for its time that many scholars once believed it had to be a myth. But Uruk was real. It had walls, temples, markets, canals, and monuments. It had writing, taxes, government, and even organized religion. By every definition, Uruk was a full society. And it appeared thousands of years before the rest of the world caught up. Let's go back to around 4000 BCE. Scattered farming villages covered the region we now call southern Iraq. They sat along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, planting barley, raising animals, building homes from mud brick, and worshipping nature gods in small shrines. But then, Uruk emerged, and it didn't just grow, it exploded. Within a few centuries, it had more than 40,000 people. At its peak, some estimates say the population reached as high as 80,000. That was unheard of for the time. Northwest other place in the world came close. What happened in Uruk was not just growth, it was transformation. For the first time in human history, people were living in districts, not just huts. There were neighborhoods, industrial areas, sacred zones, and massive temples. It had a city wall that stretched over 6 miles. The scale of construction required planning, labor coordination, and leadership. And at the center of Uruk stood the temple to Inanna, goddess of love, war, and power. This wasn't just a place of worship. It was the heart of the city's politics and economy. Priests managed land, controlled the grain supply, ran workshops, and collected taxes. The temple was a religious institution and a financial one. Uruk was also where something extraordinary happened: writing was invented. The people of Uruk developed cuneiform, the world's first known writing system. At first, it was used to track goods: how much grain was stored, how many sheep were traded, how many jars of oil were sent to the temple. They used soft clay tablets and a sharpened reed to make symbols. But those symbols eventually expanded to record myths, prayers, contracts, and laws. Writing gave people power. If something was written down, it could no longer be denied, forgotten, or ignored. It created a new kind of authority, the authority of record. With writing came administration. With administration came hierarchy. And with hierarchy came competition. Uruk was a miracle, but it was not a peaceful one. Behind the city's success were layers of control. Laborers worked long days for rations. Farmers owed part of their crops to temple officials. Class differences became visible. Those in charge lived better lives, while others served the system without voice or choice. And at the top of this early power structure stood the king, or more accurately, the Lugal, which means big men. According to later records, one of Uruk's earliest and most legendary rulers was a man named Enmerkar. He claimed to be chosen by the gods to rule not just Uruk, but all surrounding lands. Some stories say he built the walls of Uruk himself. Others suggest he invented writing to keep order among his people. What's true and what's myth is still debated, but it's clear that Enmerkar was remembered as more than a man. He was the beginning of a new kind of leader, a political figure with divine backing and organizational control. This is where the idea of divine kingship begins, the belief that a ruler is not just a person, but a representative of the gods. And with that idea, something dangerous enters history. Because once a king is seen as chosen by the heavens, questioning him becomes more than rebellion, it becomes blasphemy. Uruk's rise was a turning point in human history. It was the first city that proved civilization could work on a large scale. But its very existence raised new problems. How do you keep thousands of people fed? What happens when crops fail? How do you control people who don't want to be controlled? And what happens when one city wants more than its share? Uruk showed what humans could build. But it also showed what humans would eventually destroy to keep it. In the next chapter, we'll meet a king who came after Enmerkar, a man whose name became legend. He was part god, part man, and entirely unforgettable. His story is the first epic in world literature. His name was Gilgamesh. Chapter 3, Gilgamesh, the king who defied death. After Uruk rose from the plains of Mesopotamia to become the first great city in history, its legends began to grow just as fast. But no story from Uruk would become more famous, or more human, than the story of its greatest king. His name was Gilgamesh. And according to ancient texts, he was 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. A ruler chosen by the gods. A warrior without equal. A builder, a poet, a tyrant, and a man who tried to escape the one thing no king can outrun, death. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the world's oldest known written story. It was carved into clay tablets over 4,000 years ago. But unlike many myths, this one doesn't glorify victory or claim divine perfection. It's a story about failure, friendship, and fear of the unknown. And it all starts with a king who went too far. Gilgamesh ruled Uruk with an iron grip. He built massive walls around the city, walls so strong that fragments of them still exist today. But the people didn't love him. In the early parts of the story, he's not a hero, he's a problem. He overworked the men, took advantage of the women, and ignored the cries of his own people. He was strong. He was brilliant. But he was out of control. The people begged the gods to stop him. And the gods answered, not with punishment, but with a plan. They created Enkidu, a wild man, born in the wilderness, raised among animals. He was strong enough to challenge Gilgamesh and human enough to balance him. When the two finally met, they fought. The battle shook the streets of Uruk. Neither could defeat the other. But instead of killing each other, something unexpected happened. They became friends. True, deep, unshakable friends. Together, they decided to prove their strength, not by ruling people, but by conquering the unknown. They set out on a journey beyond the edge of the known world to defeat a monster named Humbaba, the guardian of the cedar forest. Humbaba was terrifying. A giant who breathed fire and protected the realm of the gods. But with courage and luck, Gilgamesh and Enkidu killed him. It was a great victory, but it came at a cost. The gods were furious. Gilgamesh and Enkidu had gone too far, challenged the natural order, and taken what wasn't theirs. So the gods decided someone had to pay. They chose Enkidu. Enkidu fell ill. He suffered for days, then weeks. And Gilgamesh, the unstoppable king of Uruk, could do nothing. He watched his best friend, the only person who truly understood him, die. That was the moment everything changed. Gilgamesh had faced war, monsters, and divine anger, but nothing had ever shaken him like this. For the first time, he realized something terrifying: he would die too. And he couldn't accept it. So he left his kingdom. Left his throne. Left everything. And set out on a desperate quest, not for power, not for wealth, but for immortality. He searched for Utnapishtim, a man said to have survived the Great Flood and been granted eternal life by the gods. Gilgamesh crossed deserts, climbed mountains, and entered a tunnel beneath the world. He found Utnapishtim. He heard the story of the flood, the Mesopotamian version of Noah's Ark. And he begged for the secret of eternal life. But the answer was not what he wanted to hear. Utnapishtim told him the truth. Humans were not meant to live forever. Even the greatest kings, the strongest warriors, and the most brilliant minds, all would die. There was, for a moment, a chance. Utnapishtim revealed that a plant could restore youth. Gilgamesh found it. But on his journey back, he stopped to rest. And while he slept, a snake stole the plant and slithered away. He had failed. Gilgamesh returned to Uruk, not immortal, not victorious, but wiser. He looked at the walls he had built. The temples, the gates, the homes of his people. And he realized something. This, the city, the legacy, the memory of what you create, this is what lives on. Not the body. Not the name. But the impact. The Epic of Gilgamesh is not just the first story in recorded history. It's one of the most personal. It shows that even the most powerful humans are fragile. Even kings fear loss. Even legends cry. Uruk, the city that once seemed unstoppable, was built by a man who spent his life learning how little he truly controlled. And this lesson would echo through every ruler who came after. In the next chapter, we'll go back in time. To an even older story. A hidden myth that might explain how everything nearly ended before it began. We'll explore the flood. And a strange gap in the historical record that still leaves historians guessing to this day. Chapter 4, The Secret of Eridu's Flood. After the epic tale of Gilgamesh and his quest for immortality, the story of Mesopotamia takes a darker turn, a story that might be familiar in parts but is filled with mystery and unanswered questions. We return now to a time before the great cities fully flourished, to one of the oldest and most important settlements in southern Mesopotamia, Eridu. Eridu is considered by many scholars as the world's first city, believed to have been founded around 5400 BCE. It was small at first, a cluster of mud brick houses near the marshes, by the life-giving waters of the Euphrates. But Eridu wasn't just a city. It was a religious center, the home of the god Enki, the lord of water, wisdom, and creation. Stories from ancient Mesopotamia say that Eridu was the place where civilization began, where humans first learned to farm, build, and govern themselves under the guidance of the gods. But Eridu holds a secret, one tied to the oldest and most dramatic myth in Mesopotamian culture, the flood. Long before the story of Noah, Mesopotamians told of a great flood that nearly wiped out all life on earth. According to these legends, the gods once decided that humanity had grown too noisy, too disobedient, and too dangerous. To punish them, they sent a flood to cleanse the world, a flood so massive it destroyed cities, drowned fields, and turned the fertile land into a vast sea of mud. Only one man survived. His name was Ziusidra, sometimes called Utnapishtim or Atrahasis in other versions. He was warned by the god Enki, who secretly told him to build a giant boat and save himself, his family, and a few animals. Ziusidra obeyed. He built the boat, survived the flood, and after the waters receded, he was granted eternal life by the gods. This story was told over and over in different forms across Mesopotamia, becoming the foundation for later flood myths, including the biblical account of Noah. But here's where the mystery begins. Archaeologists have found evidence that major floods did happen in southern Mesopotamia, possibly caused by changes in the rivers or natural disasters. Some layers of soil in ancient cities show thick deposits of silt and debris, suggesting catastrophic floods occurred repeatedly. But these floods weren't just natural disasters, they were also political and religious turning points. Floods destroyed food supplies, forced people to move, and caused social chaos. Temples were damaged. Kings lost power. And sometimes entire cities were abandoned. The flood myth may have been a way for people to explain these terrible events, to make sense of the destruction and loss. But some scholars believe the story hides something else. They think the flood narrative was also a way to erase the past, to wipe the slate clean and start over. If a king or city failed, their history could be buried under flood stories. The flood became a symbolic reset, a divine punishment and a chance for new order to rise. This idea connects to something called the Dark Age of Mesopotamia, a mysterious period when written records disappeared for decades, and archaeology shows many settlements were destroyed or abandoned. No one knows exactly what happened during this time, but the flood story might hold clues. Was there a great natural disaster that shattered early civilization? Was it a political coup disguised as a divine punishment? Or was it something else entirely? Eridu itself was eventually abandoned. Its temples fell silent. Its people moved on. But the flood story survived, passed down from generation to generation, becoming part of the cultural memory of Mesopotamia and beyond. The flood reminds us that even the earliest civilizations were fragile. That no matter how powerful the king, or how sacred the temple, nature and fate could still destroy everything. And it sets the stage for what comes next, the rise of the first great empire, led by a man who would change Mesopotamia forever. In the next chapter, we will meet that man, the orphan who rose from nothing to conquer all. We will see how ambition, cunning, and fate combined to build the Akkadian Empire. But for now, remember the flood. Remember the warning it carried. And remember the city of Eridu, the place where civilization nearly drowned before it could truly begin. Chapter 5, Sargon the Bastard King. The story of Mesopotamia takes a dramatic turn with the rise of a man who came from nothing, a man whose name would be remembered for millennia as the first to create a true empire. His story is one of cunning, ambition, and unexpected destiny. This is the story of Sargon of Akkad. Sargon's origins are wrapped in mystery and legend. According to ancient accounts, he was born to a humble family, possibly even of low social status. Some stories say he was abandoned as an infant and set adrift in a basket on a river, an image that echoes in myths around the world. Despite these uncertain beginnings, Sargon rose to become one of the most powerful rulers of the ancient world. Around 2334 BCE, when Mesopotamia was still a patchwork of independent city-states often fighting each other, Sargon emerged from the city of Akkad, a place whose exact location remains unknown to this day. Unlike Uruk or Eridu, Akkad was not yet famous or grand, but under Sargon's leadership, it would become the center of the first empire, the Akkadian Empire, the first time a single ruler united most of Mesopotamia under one banner. How did Sargon do it? It began with ambition and skill. Sargon was not born to rule, but he learned to use everything at his disposal: political savvy, military strategy, and perhaps most importantly, the power of storytelling. He claimed he was chosen by the gods themselves to rule. He invented and spread a new idea, that a king's right to rule did not come from birth or local tradition, but directly from the divine will. Sargon declared himself the king of the four corners of the world, a title meaning he ruled over all the lands known to his people. This was not just a boast, it was a revolutionary claim that elevated him above all other rulers. Sargon's empire stretched from the Persian Gulf in the south, through the heart of Mesopotamia, and up to parts of modern-day Syria and Turkey. He conquered cities one by one, either by military force or by making alliances. He installed loyal governors to oversee conquered territories, creating a system that allowed him to control vast lands. But ruling an empire was not easy. Sargon faced constant threats, rebellions, rival kings, and the ever-changing will of the gods. His own family would prove to be both his strength and his weakness. Sargon's son, Rimush, succeeded him but struggled to maintain control. His grandson, Naram-Sin, would push the empire to its greatest heights, and his story is one of pride, defiance, and tragedy. But more on that later. What made Sargon's story even more remarkable was how it survived and spread. Clay tablets and inscriptions praising Sargon were found hundreds of years after his death. He was remembered as a legendary figure, sometimes worshipped almost like a god. Sargon's story was retold with exaggerations and mythical elements, blending history and legend. But the real Sargon was a man who reshaped the world. He created the first empire by breaking down old city-state rivalries and uniting diverse peoples under one administration. He introduced innovations like a professional army, standardized weights and measures, and a common language, Akkadian. He built roads and trade networks that connected distant regions. And perhaps most importantly, he showed that power could be centralized, maintained, and passed down. However, empires built on ambition are fragile. After Sargon's death, his empire slowly began to weaken. The governors grew too powerful. Internal conflicts erupted. And natural disasters like famine and drought made life harder for ordinary people. But for a time, Sargon's empire was the greatest power on earth. His rise changed Mesopotamia forever. From a land of competing city-states, it became a single political and cultural entity. Sargon was the first to prove that a man of no royal blood could rise by force and skill to command the fate of millions. His story inspired kings and conquerors for thousands of years. And yet, beneath the grandeur and glory, there was a darker side. Sargon's reign was marked by violence, control, and a relentless drive for power. He ruled with fear as much as respect. His empire demanded loyalty and obedience. The people who lived under him often paid a heavy price. But without Sargon, the history of Mesopotamia would have been very different. He was the man who planted the seed of empire, a seed that would grow, change, and sometimes destroy everything in its path. In the next chapter, we will explore the collapse of the Akkadian Empire, the mystery behind its sudden downfall, and a shocking secret involving the gods themselves. For now, remember the story of Sargon, the bastard king who became the greatest ruler of his time. Chapter 6: The Akkadian Collapse and the God Who Vanished. Sargon of Akkad built the first empire in human history, a vast realm stretching from the Persian Gulf to the mountains of the north. It was an unprecedented achievement, uniting dozens of city-states, peoples, and cultures under one ruler. For decades, the Akkadian Empire stood as a beacon of power, innovation, and centralized governance. But this greatness was fragile, and after only about a century, the empire began a catastrophic collapse. This collapse wasn't the result of a single battle or one decisive event. It was a perfect storm of environmental disaster, internal strife, and divine wrath. The story of how the Akkadian Empire fell is one of the earliest and most mysterious examples of imperial failure, a tragedy that still puzzles historians today. Environmental disaster, the silent enemy. Around 2200 BCE, Mesopotamia faced a massive environmental crisis. Scientists have identified what is now called the 4.2 kilo-year event, a period of severe and prolonged drought affecting a wide area from Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley. This drought was unlike anything the region had seen before in recorded history. For a civilization that depended on the flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers to irrigate crops and sustain cities, this drought was catastrophic. The river's flow diminished, the fertile soil dried up, and food production plummeted. Farmers watched helplessly as their fields turned barren. Grain stores, central to the empire's economy and food security, ran dangerously low. Without enough food, cities faced famine, and famine bred unrest. The empire's strength was built on controlling agriculture, on managing grain, water, and labor. When the environment no longer cooperated, the delicate balance shattered. Political fragmentation and rebellion. While nature dealt its harshest blow, internal politics worsened the situation. The Akkadian Empire was vast, stretching over a diverse range of peoples and cities with different languages, traditions, and loyalties. Sargon and his successors had maintained control through a centralized system of governors and military garrisons. But as resources became scarce and the central authority weakened, many of these local rulers began to rebel. Ancient inscriptions mention revolts in cities like Uruk, Nippur, and other formerly loyal centers. Governors stopped paying tribute and declared independence. With communication and supply lines disrupted by drought and rebellion, the empire's cohesion crumbled. This collapse was not a quick fall but a slow, grinding process. Decades of political instability weakened the empire from within. The vanishing of a god, Dagon's silence. In Mesopotamian culture, gods were deeply connected to kingship and the state's survival. The favor of the gods was believed to guarantee prosperity, protection, and victory. Among the gods worshipped in Akkad, Dagon held a crucial role. He was a god of fertility, grain, and harvest, the very forces that kept the empire alive. Yet, during the collapse, Dagon's presence in the records suddenly disappears. This vanishing is not accidental, it was interpreted as the gods abandoning the empire. Texts from later periods describe how the gods turned their backs on Akkad because of the ruler's hubris and failures. This divine punishment was seen as the ultimate cause of the empire's destruction. Religious leaders claimed that the rulers had offended the gods by their arrogance, by overreaching their power, and by neglecting sacred duties. This loss of divine favor was terrifying because it suggested the empire's fate was sealed not just by human failings but by cosmic judgment. Evidence from the ground, archaeology speaks. Archaeological excavations across ancient Mesopotamian cities reveal signs of destruction, abandonment, and dramatic social change at this time. Moreover, the damage from wars and rebellions left deep scars. Cities were razed in fighting, their populations displaced or killed. The once thriving trade routes fractured, cutting off vital exchanges of goods and ideas. With less commerce, wealth dried up. The spiritual life of the region also faced disruption. Temples, centers not only of worship but of economic and political power, fell into neglect. Priests lost influence as kings disappeared and the gods' favor seemed uncertain. Written records, which had flourished under the Akkadians, suddenly vanish. The cuneiform tablets that once chronicled kings, battles, laws, and prayers become scarce. This silence in the archives is why historians call this the Age of Silence. But silence does not mean emptiness. Despite the gaps, this era saw the slow and painful survival of Mesopotamian culture. In some regions, smaller city-states held on, preserving traditions and slowly rebuilding. People adapted to new realities, farming in more sustainable ways, forging local alliances, and maintaining religious practices quietly. This period is also crucial because it marks the transition from the Akkadian world to the rise of the Ur-3 dynasty, often called the Sumerian Renaissance. Centuries later, new kings would look back to the past, revive ancient gods and rituals, and rebuild cities on older foundations. The Age of Silence is a reminder of the fragility of civilization. It shows that no matter how advanced or powerful a society may seem, it can falter when faced with environmental pressures, political collapse, and spiritual crisis. Yet from this silence, new stories would emerge, new kings would rise, new cities would bloom, and the people of Mesopotamia would once again create history. At many sites, layers of ash and broken pottery mark violent episodes. Buildings were burned and left unrepaired. Temples once vibrant with worship fell into ruin. Thousands of people may have fled cities, migrating to safer areas or disappearing entirely from the historical record. These physical traces match the stories of rebellion, famine, and disaster found in the texts. The aftermath and the lessons. The collapse of Akkad reshaped Mesopotamia. For a time, the region fragmented back into independent city-states, much like it was before Sargon. New powers eventually rose, like the city-state of Ur and later Babylon. But the memory of Akkad's fall served as a powerful lesson for future rulers. They learned that power must be balanced with humility. That the environment can be a ruler as much as any king. That divine favor was fragile and required constant attention. The gods' silence over Akkad haunted Mesopotamian rulers for centuries. They understood that empires could fall not just by force of arms but by losing the gods' support. The end of Akkad's story, the beginning of Mesopotamia's legacy. Though the Akkadian Empire vanished, its influence remained. Its language, administration, and cultural ideas spread throughout the Near East. The collapse showed future generations the dangers of empire building and the power of nature and religion. It was a dramatic, painful chapter, a reminder that no empire, no matter how great, is guaranteed to last. In the next chapter, we will meet Naram-Sin, Sargon's grandson. A king who dared to claim godhood for himself, challenging the limits that brought down his grandfather's empire. Chapter 7, Naram-Sin, the king who made himself a god. When Naram-Sin ascended the throne of Akkad, he inherited a kingdom that was both powerful and precarious. The empire built by his grandfather Sargon had expanded rapidly but faced constant threats, internal rebellions, strained resources, and the growing discontent of conquered peoples. His father, Rimesh, had struggled to maintain control, and the weight of ruling such a vast and diverse empire fell heavily on Naram-Sin's shoulders. But Naram-Sin was no ordinary king. From the moment he took power around 2254 BCE, he distinguished himself as a warrior, a leader, and above all, a man with an insatiable hunger for glory. Unlike his predecessors, who portrayed themselves primarily as representatives or servants of the gods, Naram-Sin took a dramatic and unprecedented step. He claimed divine status for himself. He declared that he was not merely chosen by the gods, he was a god. This bold proclamation changed the entire nature of kingship in Mesopotamia. To declare oneself divine was to blur the sacred boundary between mortals and the gods, and such a claim was both provocative and revolutionary. On stone reliefs from his reign, Naram-Sin is depicted wearing the horned crown, the unmistakable symbol of divinity. In one famous carving, he stands atop a mountain of defeated enemies, his spear raised high, eyes lifted toward the heavens, his body larger than life and clearly set apart from mere mortals. The text accompanying the relief proudly calls him God of Akkad and King of the Four Corners of the world, emphasizing his dominion over all lands and peoples. To his subjects, Naram-Sin was not just a ruler, he was a divine force incarnate on earth. This elevated status gave him extraordinary authority, but it also created unease and controversy. While some likely revered him as a living god, others, especially among the priesthood and traditional elites, viewed his claims as dangerous hubris, a direct challenge to the established religious order. Naram-Sin's reign was marked by vigorous military campaigns. He led his armies deep into mountainous regions and distant territories, extending the empire's reach farther than any before him. Cities that resisted were crushed under his iron fist. His conquests were ruthless. Ancient records tell of entire populations being uprooted, lands plundered, and enemies annihilated. But even with his divine status and military prowess, Naram-Sin faced constant challenges. Rebellions erupted across the empire, fueled by ethnic tensions, economic hardships, and dissatisfaction with centralized control. His attempts to suppress dissent were brutal and unyielding, often involving severe punishments designed to instill fear and obedience. The religious dimension of Naram-Sin's rule is particularly fascinating. The gods were central to Mesopotamian life and politics, their favor was essential to a king's legitimacy. By claiming godhood himself, Naram-Sin placed himself above even these deities in the eyes of many. This audacity may have been perceived as an affront to the gods, and ancient texts suggest that divine wrath was kindled by his arrogance. One legendary story tells how Enlil, the chief god and god of wind and storms, withdrew his favor from Naram-Sin, condemning him for his presumption. This curse was believed to bring misfortune and turmoil, hastening the decline of the empire. Indeed, after years of conflict and conquest, Naram-Sin's reign ended amid growing instability. His death did not bring peace but rather accelerated the empire's fragmentation. Governors seized power, cities rebelled, and external enemies pressed inward. Despite the turmoil, Naram-Sin's legacy was profound and enduring. He forever changed the concept of kingship in Mesopotamia by introducing the idea of divine rulership, a theme that would resonate through the region's history. Later kings would emulate his example, though few dared to claim outright godhood. Naram-Sin's story is one of ambition, power, and the peril of overreaching. It illustrates how the pursuit of ultimate authority can both elevate and destroy. His reign symbolizes the heights of Akkadian achievement and the beginning of its unraveling. More than 4 millennia later, his name still echoes through history as a king who dared to walk among the gods, and whose empire paid the price for that boldness. As the Akkadian Empire faded, a mysterious period followed, an era shrouded in silence and uncertainty, setting the stage for the next chapter of Mesopotamian history. Chapter 8, The Age of Silence, When History Paused. For all the grandeur and drama of the Akkadian Empire, after its collapse, Mesopotamia entered a period unlike any before or after, a mysterious era often called the Age of Silence. This was a time when the vibrant cities that had once thrived under kings like Sargon and Naram-Sin fell quiet, records stopped, and the land seemed to hold its breath. The Age of Silence is not a single event but a stretch of decades, perhaps a century, during which the written history of Mesopotamia abruptly thins. Archaeological evidence shows widespread destruction, abandonment, and turmoil. Yet, for all its mystery, this silent era is as significant as any period of conquest or cultural flourish. It reveals the raw, often brutal reality of ancient civilization and sets the stage for the rebirth of Mesopotamia's great cities. Imagine standing on the plains between the Tigris and Euphrates around 2150 BCE. The ruins of once great cities lie abandoned. The streets are empty, temples crumble, and the irrigation canals that once brought life to the land are clogged or dry. The very heart of civilization seems broken. What caused this profound silence? Many factors converge to bring about this dark chapter. The devastating droughts and environmental stresses that hastened Akkad's fall did not simply vanish. Climate change continued to grip the region, making farming difficult and pushing populations to the brink. Famine and scarcity bred desperation. At the same time, the political order that had once united the region fractured. The central authority of the Akkadian kings was gone. In its place, local city-states, once tightly controlled, struggled to survive on their own. Power vacuums led to conflicts, raids, and instability. Without strong leadership, many cities could not maintain their walls or supply systems. Chapter 9, Uarnamu and the Dawn of a New Era. After decades of turmoil, silence, and uncertainty, the plains of southern Mesopotamia began to stir once again. From the ruins and memories of fallen empires, a new leader emerged, one who would rebuild, reform, and reshape the destiny of the ancient world. His name was Uarnamu, and his reign marked the beginning of what historians call the Ur-3 dynasty or the Sumerian Renaissance. To understand the significance of Uarnamu's rise, we must first imagine the context in which he appeared. The great Akkadian Empire had crumbled. The cities were fractured and weakened. The rivers that once nourished the land were unpredictable, and the people had suffered famine, war, and displacement. The very foundations of civilization seemed unstable. Yet amid this chaos, the city of Ur, an ancient city with a rich heritage, stood as a beacon of hope. Located near the mouth of the Euphrates River, Ur had been a center of worship and trade since Sumerian times. Its people were proud, determined, and eager to reclaim their place in history. Uarnamu was a man of vision and determination. According to the inscriptions and records that survive, he rose from relative obscurity to become the governor of Ur. But unlike many before him, he didn't simply seek power for personal gain. He had a grander ambition, to restore order and justice to the land. One of Uarnamu's most enduring legacies is his law code, one of the earliest known legal systems in history. This code set down rules about justice, property rights, contracts, and punishments. Unlike the harsh and arbitrary laws of earlier times, Uarnamu's laws were designed to be fair and clear, offering protections for the weak and punishments proportionate to crimes. For example, his code prescribed specific fines for theft and compensation for bodily injury. It also emphasized the role of the king as a guardian of justice, a leader who ruled not just by power, but by fairness. This was revolutionary. It showed a shift in how kingship was understood, from divine absolutism to a system that recognized the needs of society and the rule of law. Uarnamu also undertook massive building projects. One of his most famous achievements was the reconstruction of the Great Ziggurat of Ur, a massive step temple dedicated to the moon god Nana, the city's patron deity. The ziggurat was more than a religious monument, it symbolized the city's revival and Uarnamu's dedication to restoring divine favor. Under his rule, Ur became a flourishing center of culture, religion, and trade. The administration was reorganized, with governors and officials appointed to oversee provinces and ensure order. Trade networks expanded, bringing goods and wealth from faraway lands. But Uarnamu's reign was not without challenges. He had to defend his city and the growing kingdom against rival states and nomadic tribes who threatened stability. His military campaigns were recorded as successes, demonstrating his skill both as a warrior and a diplomat. The new dynasty he founded was called the Third Dynasty of Ur, a name that reflected a conscious effort to connect with the ancient Sumerian past, even as it incorporated new Akkadian influences. This blending of cultures marked a high point in Mesopotamian civilization. Sumerian language and traditions were revived alongside Akkadian, creating a rich cultural tapestry. The scribes and scholars of Ur3 produced detailed records, literature, and scientific texts that give modern historians a clear window into daily life, economy, and governance. Ur-Nammu's death did not end this renaissance. His successors, including his son Shulgi, continued his work, strengthening the empire, promoting law and order, and advancing culture. Together, they built what some consider the first true state in history, a centralized government with a bureaucracy, codified laws, and monumental architecture. But beneath this success, pressures remained. Environmental challenges, border conflicts, and internal dissent lurked beneath the surface, foreshadowing future struggles. Still, Ur-Nammu's reign stands as a shining example of renewal and hope, a time when the ancient world rediscovered its strength and set new standards for justice, leadership, and civilization. Chapter 10, Shulgi, the King of Kings and Reformer of the Realm. When Ur-Nammu passed from the throne, he left behind a kingdom reborn, a kingdom of law, order, and renewed faith. But it was his son, Shulgi, who would take the reins and transform this nascent state into the most powerful and sophisticated empire Mesopotamia had ever seen. His reign, which lasted nearly 5 decades, marked a golden age of political consolidation, cultural flourishing, and administrative innovation. Shulgi's story begins with a promise to not only honor his father's legacy but to surpass it. He was crowned king around 2094 BCE, a time when many surrounding regions remained fragmented and chaotic. Unlike rulers before him who had to fight merely to hold power, Shulgi inherited a relatively stable base. Yet, stability was only the beginning. What set Shulgi apart was his unparalleled ambition and his keen sense of statecraft. He understood that true power was not just about conquest or religious authority, but about the effective management of resources, people, and information. From the earliest days of his reign, Shulgi undertook massive reforms aimed at centralizing authority. He expanded the empire's bureaucracy, appointing officials to oversee every aspect of governance, from tax collection and irrigation to justice and military organization. His administrators kept detailed records on clay tablets, allowing the state to track food supplies, labor, and wealth with remarkable precision. This bureaucratic sophistication was unprecedented and laid the groundwork for a highly organized government that could sustain itself over vast territories. But Shulgi's ambitions extended beyond administration. He declared himself not just a king, but the king of the 4 corners of the world, echoing the grandiose claims of Sargon and Naram-Sin. Yet, unlike his infamous grandfather and great-grandfather, Shulgi balanced this divine claim with an emphasis on justice and piety. He cultivated an image of himself as a servant of the gods, a protector of temples, and a lawgiver. His hymns and inscriptions celebrate his devotion to the gods, his building of temples, and his role as a shepherd who cares for his people. One of the most extraordinary aspects of Shulgi's reign was his self-promotion through literature and art. He commissioned a vast body of royal hymns and poetry that portrayed him as a divine and heroic figure, blending the lines between man and God. These texts were read aloud in temples and courts, shaping public perception and reinforcing his authority. Shulgi was also a military leader who secured his borders and expanded his influence through both warfare and diplomacy. His campaigns reached far into the Zagros Mountains and beyond, subduing rebellious tribes and securing trade routes critical for the empire's economy. Under Shulgi, the city of Ur and its surrounding territories became centers of commerce and culture. The roads were repaired and extended, allowing for the efficient movement of goods and soldiers. Markets flourished, and artisans produced exquisite works of pottery, sculpture, and jewelry. Religiously, Shulgi reinforced the central role of the pantheon, particularly the moon god Nana, patron of Ur. He rebuilt and expanded temples, ensuring the gods were honored and, through them, the state was legitimized. However, Shulgi's long reign was not without challenges. Maintaining such a vast empire required constant vigilance. Droughts and environmental issues persisted, threatening agriculture and food security. Rebellions occasionally flared in distant provinces, and the burden of taxation sometimes caused unrest among the common people. Despite these pressures, Shulgi's reforms and leadership kept the empire strong and unified. His ability to adapt governance, law, and religious practice to meet the needs of his time was key to the Ur3 dynasty's longevity. His death, after nearly 50 years on the throne, marked the end of an era, but the structures he created would influence Mesopotamia for generations. Shulgi's reign stands as one of the earliest examples of a ruler who combined military might, religious devotion, administrative genius, and cultural patronage to build a lasting legacy. Chapter 11: The Later Third Kings and the Fall of the Dynasty. After the long and glorious reign of King Shulgi, the empire he so carefully strengthened did not collapse immediately. In fact, for a time, it endured. The machine of governance he built continued to function, temples remained active, cities stayed connected through roads and messengers, and scribes still filled tablets with records. His successors, particularly Amarsin, Shusin, and Ibisin, inherited both the wealth of the empire and the burden of preserving it. But while the facade of strength held, cracks began to form beneath the surface. The kings that followed Shulgi faced a very different world. Their challenge wasn't building an empire, it was holding one together against time itself. Shulgi's son Amarsin ascended to the throne after his father's death. Like his father, Amarsin saw himself as a divine ruler and continued many of Shulgi's religious and administrative practices. He kept the temple networks funded, led building projects, and carried out military campaigns to suppress restive provinces. His inscription spoke proudly of victories and piety, but there are subtle signs of trouble in the record. In Amarsin's reign, we see the first signs of environmental and political stress returning to Mesopotamia. Drought cycles again began to affect agriculture. Tributary regions in the north and east became increasingly difficult to control. Border defenses had to be rebuilt and fortified more often. Military campaigns became reactive, aimed at containment rather than conquest. Following Amarsin, the throne passed to Shusin, another royal son tasked with managing an empire that was growing weary. Shusin inherited more than crown and titles, he inherited unresolved problems. One of his most notable accomplishments was the construction of a massive defensive wall, often referred to in later texts as the Wall of Martu. This enormous fortification stretched across the western frontier and was intended to keep out Amorite tribes, semi-nomadic peoples who had grown increasingly aggressive and disruptive. The fact that such a wall had to be built is telling. It suggests not just outside threats but a weakening grip on the empire's borders. The Amorites were not merely raiders, they were slowly penetrating the political and cultural fabric of Mesopotamia. Many settled in small villages on the fringes of the empire, sometimes integrating peacefully, but often clashing with central authority. Shusin also dealt with growing economic issues. Administrative records from his reign show delays in tax collection, increased grain shortages, and reports of land disputes. The central bureaucracy, once the empire's greatest strength, was now struggling under its own complexity. Corruption may have crept into the ranks of local governors. Some cities started to drift from imperial control, maintaining loyalty in name but increasingly acting independently. By the time Ibisin, the last king of the Ur-3 dynasty, came to power, the storm was already upon them. Ibisin's reign is one of the most tragic in Mesopotamian history, a slow unraveling of power, honor, and the illusion of control. The early years of his reign were marked by drought, poor harvests, and rising prices for food and basic goods. The once mighty trade routes that connected Ur to distant lands became unreliable, if not altogether abandoned. Internal dissent grew. Governors and military leaders, once loyal, began acting as regional warlords. The bureaucracy, overwhelmed and underfunded, could no longer enforce the king's will. To make matters worse, a powerful force was rising from the north, the Elamites, a longtime rival of Mesopotamian states. The Elamites, seizing the moment of weakness, began to raid Mesopotamian cities. They weren't simply pillaging, they were aiming to conquer. Ibisin, isolated in Ur, tried desperately to hold the center. He issued proclamations, begged distant cities for support, and attempted to maintain the rituals and ceremonies that once gave the king divine legitimacy. But the people no longer believed. As city after city declared independence or was overrun, the empire collapsed inward. In the final years, Ur stood alone, cut off, starving, and surrounded. The grand temples of the moon god Nana, once filled with offerings and song, grew quiet. In 2004 BCE, the final blow came. The Elamites invaded the city of Ur itself. They sacked it brutally, looting temples, destroying palaces, and carrying off Ibisin in chains. His fate remains uncertain, some sources suggest he died in captivity. Others say he was executed. The fall of Ur-3 was not just the end of a dynasty. It was the end of the last great Sumerian kingdom. For centuries, Sumerian language and culture had defined southern Mesopotamia. With Uruk's fall, the Sumerian world, its kings, its myths, its divine order, was gone. Though scribes would continue to write in Sumerian for religious and academic purposes, the spoken language faded. Akkadian, the tongue of Sargon, became dominant. But the memory of Ur-3 lived on. Its law codes would influence later Babylonian kings. Its administrative practices became templates for future empires. Its literature, preserved on clay tablets, would be copied and studied for generations. The story of its fall became a warning passed down through history, a tale of hubris, mismanagement, and the relentless passage of time. Even the most organized empire, even the most devout and ambitious king, could not halt the cycles of decline. Chapter 12: The Rise of the Amorites and the Return to City Kings. In the shadow of Uruk's collapse, southern Mesopotamia descended into a period of uncertainty and division. The centralized bureaucracy, carefully crafted by Shulgi and his predecessors, had crumbled. The palaces were silent, the grain stores were empty, and the kings no longer ruled from shining thrones. But the story of Mesopotamia didn't end here. Instead, a new chapter began, one of fragmentation, survival, and slow, unpredictable rebirth. At the heart of this transformation were the Amorites, a people who had once lingered on the edges of Mesopotamian society, dismissed as outsiders, raiders, and troublemakers. For centuries, they had been seen as a nuisance by the Sumerians and Akkadians, a nomadic population from the west who lived in tents and moved with their herds. They spoke a distinct Semitic dialect, followed different customs, and were viewed by the settled peoples of the land as uncivilized. But history has a way of turning tables. As the mighty Ur-3 dynasty fell to the Elamites, and as cities broke away into isolated strongholds, the Amorites seized their moment. Where central authority had collapsed, they filled the vacuum, not as invaders, but as rulers. The Amorite transformation was not a sudden invasion or a mass conquest. It was more subtle. Over generations, Amorite tribes had already begun settling in Mesopotamian towns and villages. They intermarried with local populations, adopted elements of Mesopotamian religion, and became part of the local economy. But now, with the weakening of old elites, Amorite leaders began rising to positions of power in cities across the land. One by one, ancient cities, Uruk, Isin, Larsa, and eventually Babylon, came under the control of Amorite dynasties. The age of empire had ended, and in its place returned the old model, city kings. These rulers controlled one city and the surrounding territory, often in competition or alliance with their neighbors. It was a return to the pattern of the early Sumerian age, but now with new actors, a new language, and new ambitions. Among the most notable cities during this period was Isin, located near the ruins of Ur. The kings of Isin declared themselves the rightful heirs of Ur-3's legacy. They restored temples, revived Sumerian rituals, and issued laws in the traditional style. Their goal was to legitimize their power by linking it to the glorious past. In contrast, the nearby city of Larsa, under Amorite leadership, was less interested in tradition and more focused on asserting dominance through military and economic strength. Over time, Isin and Larsa became bitter rivals, each vying for control over trade routes and religious centers. Wars were frequent, alliances shifted constantly, and the political map of southern Mesopotamia became a tangled web of competing city-states. The Amorites brought change, but they didn't discard the past. They adopted the Akkadian language, which was now the lingua franca of the region. They maintained the use of cuneiform and continued the worship of traditional gods like Enlil, Inanna, and Shamash. But they also brought their own cultural flavors, new gods from the West, different legal practices, and fresh perspectives on kingship. In many ways, the rise of the Amorites marked a turning point in Mesopotamian history. They were not conquerors in the traditional sense, but inheritors who reshaped the old world into something new. This period was chaotic and often violent. Without a central authority, cities fortified themselves, armies clashed frequently, and no single power could claim dominance. But out of this chaos, new possibilities emerged. One city, still small and relatively unimportant at this stage, would soon rise to dominate them all. Nestled along the Euphrates River, Babylon, once just a provincial town, was slowly growing under Amorite rule. Its kings were still minor players in regional politics, but that would soon change. In the coming decades, an Amorite king named Hammurabi would rise from Babylon and shape the destiny of all Mesopotamia. But before that story begins, the land would continue to simmer with rivalries, rebuilding efforts, and the search for stability. The age of city kings had returned. Power had become local again. And though the grandeur of empire was gone, the spirit of Mesopotamia endured, its temples still stood, its scribes still wrote, and its people, once again, adapted to the times. Chapter 13, Hammurabi, the lawgiver and master of Babylon. In the early 18th century BCE, the city of Babylon was still a modest power compared to its older, more established rivals like Larsa, Eshnunna, and Elam. It had no grand temples like Nippur, no legendary kings like Uar, no heroic legacy to boast of. But that would all change under the reign of a single man, Hammurabi. His rise was not immediate. It was slow, calculated, and fueled not just by ambition but by extraordinary political skill, military patience, and a legacy that would outlast empires. Hammurabi ascended to the throne of Babylon around 1792 BCE. When he took power, Babylon was just one of many city-states ruled by Amorite dynasties. It was not feared. It was not envied. But Hammurabi had a different vision. He saw not just Babylon's future, but the future of all Mesopotamia, shaped under a new kind of rule, one based not just on conquest, but on law, unity, and divine authority. In the early years of his reign, Hammurabi moved carefully. He strengthened the city's walls, organized the army, rebuilt temples, and improved the irrigation canals that sustained the surrounding farmlands. He made alliances where possible and avoided wars he wasn't ready for. Like a master chess player, he observed the other kings, watching, waiting, learning. The region at this time was a tense, shifting battlefield of rival kingdoms. To the southeast was Larsa, ruled by Rim-Sin, a powerful and aggressive king who controlled valuable trade routes. To the north lay Eshnunna, another strong Amorite kingdom, rich and expanding. In the west, the ancient kingdom of Mari controlled key river passages. And further beyond, always threatening, were the Elamites, who had once destroyed Uar and still raided from the east. Hammurabi spent the first 2 decades of his reign building quietly, often under the radar of these powers. But then, as the political landscape began to shift, he struck. His first major move came when Elamite forces grew too bold, threatening Babylon's eastern frontier. Rather than simply defend, Hammurabi launched a counterattack and pushed them back. This victory earned him respect and fear. Next, he turned his attention to Larsa. For decades, Rim-Sin had ruled like a king of kings, extracting tribute from lesser cities and presenting himself as the dominant power in southern Mesopotamia. Hammurabi, once his junior, now challenged him directly. The campaign was brutal and brilliant. Hammurabi formed temporary alliances with other city-states to isolate Larsa. Then, with a well-coordinated military strike, he captured the city and deposed Rim-Sin. It was a turning point. With Larsa under his control, Hammurabi now ruled most of Sumer. But he was far from finished. Next came Eshnunna, a rival in the north. It had once posed a serious threat, but now, with Larsa gone, it stood exposed. Hammurabi launched a northern campaign, capturing its territories, cities, and key trade networks. His momentum was unstoppable. Then he turned west toward Mari. Though Mari had once been an ally, its king, Zimri-Lim, was growing increasingly independent. Hammurabi saw no room for divided loyalties. In a bold betrayal, he attacked and conquered Mari, destroying its palace and archives, and solidifying his control over the Euphrates River system. In just a few short years, Hammurabi had gone from a regional king to master of all Mesopotamia. No one could match his power. He had united the land from the Persian Gulf to the Syrian desert. Babylon was no longer a city among many, it was the city, the beating heart of a new empire. But Hammurabi's true genius was not just in war. It was in how he ruled. To govern such a vast and diverse land, Hammurabi knew he needed more than fear. He needed order, legitimacy, and a system of justice that could outlive him. And so, he created what is now his most famous legacy, the Code of Hammurabi. Carved into a towering stone stele over 7 feet tall, the code listed nearly 300 laws covering everything from trade, agriculture, marriage, theft, slavery, contracts, and even medical malpractice. These laws were not equal, different punishments existed for nobles and commoners, but they were detailed, public, and enforced by royal decree. The top of the stele shows Hammurabi standing before Shamash, the sun god and god of justice, receiving the laws as divine wisdom. This was no mere political document, it was a sacred mandate. By positioning himself as the chosen enforcer of divine law, Hammurabi secured both religious and political legitimacy. The laws themselves reflected a deeply stratified but highly organized society. Penalties were harsh but structured. A builder whose house collapsed could be put to death. A merchant who cheated could face severe fines. A son who struck his father could lose his hand. Justice was not kind, but it was clear, and in the ancient world, that was revolutionary. Under Hammurabi, Babylon became a true capital, home to scholars, scribes, priests, and merchants. The temples flourished, schools taught both Sumerian and Akkadian writing, and taxes flowed into a well-managed bureaucracy. Yet, for all its brilliance, Hammurabi's empire was also fragile. He had ruled through his personal charisma, military power, and administrative reforms. But after his death, Babylon struggled to maintain the unity he had forged. Rivals re-emerged. Provinces broke away. And over time, the empire splintered once more. Still, his legacy endured. For centuries, kings would copy his laws, cite his justice, and revere his name. In later Babylonian and Assyrian courts, Hammurabi was remembered as the model king, the ruler who brought divine order to the world. His code is one of the oldest known legal systems still preserved today, a window into the values, fears, and hopes of one of the world's first great civilizations. Chapter 14: The Rise of Assyria, Warriors from the North. As the sun slowly set on Hammurabi's Babylonian empire, another power stirred far to the north, one that had waited patiently in the background for centuries. While Sumerian cities battled for dominance and Babylon basked in glory, the city of Ashur watched and endured. Located along the banks of the upper Tigris River, Ashur was a city of merchants, temple priests, and cautious kings. But in time, it would become the heart of a new force in Mesopotamian history, Assyria. The early Assyrians were not yet the fearsome empire builders they would one day become. In the 20th to 18th centuries BCE, they were primarily traders. Ashur's location made it a key hub along caravan routes connecting Mesopotamia to Anatolia in the north and the Zagros Mountains in the east. Assyrian merchants traveled thousands of kilometers, establishing outposts and trading colonies as far as Canes, modern-day Kultepe in Turkey, where they traded textiles, tin, and silver. These early commercial ventures were so successful that thousands of business records, contracts, debts, and shipments survive on cuneiform tablets packed into private archives. But behind the merchant activity, the seeds of power were already being sown. Unlike the flat alluvial plains of Sumer and Akkad, Assyria's homeland was rugged and defensible. The climate was harsher, the rivers faster, and the terrain more challenging. These conditions produced a people who were hardened, disciplined, and fiercely independent. While they respected the culture of the south, adopting its writing system, religion, and laws, they maintained their own identity. As Babylon weakened after Hammurabi's death, Ashur began to grow. Assyrian kings, still modest in title and ambition, expanded their control to nearby cities. They secured trade routes, raised small armies, and built fortifications. By the 14th century BCE, the Assyrians had developed into a kingdom in their own right, capable of defending their borders and asserting regional influence. But it wasn't until the reign of Ashur-uballit I around 1365 BCE that Assyria made its first bold move onto the international stage. Ashur-uballit broke free from Babylonian dominance and declared Assyria an independent kingdom, no longer a vassal to the south. He didn't just claim power, he proved it on the battlefield. He defeated neighboring tribes, secured northern trade routes, and even corresponded with the great kings of Egypt and the Hittites as an equal. In doing so, he planted the idea that Assyria could be more than a regional kingdom. It could become an empire. His successors continued this path. Assyrian kings built stronger armies, expanded their territories, and developed a military tradition that would define their civilization for centuries. Unlike their Babylonian neighbors, who focused heavily on law, writing, and urban planning, the Assyrians became obsessed with military discipline, conquest, and control. They built roads for armies, not just for trade. They trained soldiers as professionals, not temporary conscripts. Their kings were warriors first, administrators second. By the 13th century BCE, kings like Adad-nirari I and Tukulti-Ninurta I pushed Assyrian boundaries deep into Mesopotamia, defeating Mitanni kings in the west and Babylonians in the south. Tukulti-Ninurta even captured Babylon itself and declared himself its king, something no Assyrian had ever done before. He built a new capital city, Kartukulti-Ninurta, and attempted to centralize power in a way similar to the old Akkadian kings. But Assyria's rise was not without conflict. The region was volatile, filled with shifting alliances and hostile neighbors, the Kassites in Babylon, the Hittites to the northwest, Elamites to the east, and new powers emerging along the Mediterranean coast. The Assyrian kings of this period were constantly at war, constantly building, and constantly fearing internal rebellion. There were setbacks. Assyrian kings were assassinated. Cities rebelled. Babylonia struck back. Empires like the Hittites and the mysterious Sea peoples disrupted the balance of power across the Near East. Yet Assyria survived. And more importantly, it learned. By the 12th century BCE, Assyria had become something new, a kingdom not just of warriors or traders, but of strategy, iron discipline, and long-term vision. Its scribes recorded everything. Its generals trained year-round. Its engineers mastered siege warfare and logistics. Its kings claimed to rule not just a region but all lands under heaven. But the Assyrians were still sharpening their tools. The full power of Assyria had not yet been unleashed. That would come later, in the Iron Age, when kings like Tiglath-Pileser III, Sargon II, and Ashurbanipal would turn Assyria into the most feared empire the world had ever seen. For now, Assyria stood on the edge of greatness. Its cities buzzed with construction. Its soldiers drilled in formation. Its kings plotted new campaigns. And the world watched, uneasily, as these warriors from the north prepared to reshape the ancient world once again. Chapter 15, The Neo-Babylonian Revival and the Shadow of Empire. Even as the iron boots of the Assyrian armies thundered across Mesopotamia, a different rhythm was quietly building in the south, one of memory, resilience, and rebirth. The city of Babylon, long overshadowed by northern conquests and political instability, had not vanished. Though battered by invasions and weakened by centuries of foreign rule, it had not forgotten who it was. Babylon remembered the days of Hammurabi. It remembered the ancient ziggurats, the codes of law, the sacred canals, and the whispers of the gods. By the 10th century BCE, Babylon had become a city of flickering light, still alive, still revered, but politically subdued. The once great capital had fallen under Kassite, Assyrian, and Elamite control at different points, each leaving its mark. Yet none of these conquerors could erase the Babylonian identity. The city remained a spiritual center for southern Mesopotamia, and its temples, especially the great temple of Marduk, the chief god of Babylon, continued to draw pilgrims and scholars alike. But Babylon wanted more than reverence. It wanted revenge, and eventually, resurgence. The revival began in the 7th century BCE, during the waning days of the mighty Neo-Assyrian Empire. Assyria, now overextended and understrained from years of warfare and rebellion, had begun to falter. Its harsh policies, forced deportations, brutal taxation, relentless military campaigns, had kept the empire united by fear, not loyalty. In many of the cities it ruled, especially in Babylonia, the resentment ran deep. The tipping point came when a general named Nabopolassar, believed to be of Chaldean descent, declared independence in Babylon around 626 BCE. His timing was perfect. Assyria was locked in succession crises and war on multiple fronts. Nabopolassar seized the moment, rallied the people of Babylonia, and forged alliances with discontented regions, most notably with the Medes, a rising Iranian power to the northeast. Together, the Babylonians and Medes launched a devastating campaign against Assyria. It was not just a military effort, it was a reckoning. By 612 BCE, the unthinkable happened. Nineveh, the proud Assyrian capital, fell. Its palaces were looted, its libraries burned, its towers toppled. The Neo-Assyrian Empire, the greatest military power the ancient world had ever seen, collapsed. The victors divided its remains, and Nabopolassar became king not only of Babylon but of a new empire. Thus began the Neo-Babylonian Empire. This was not a mere return to the old days. The Neo-Babylonian Empire would become bigger, richer, and in many ways more impressive than Hammurabi's kingdom centuries before. Nabopolassar's son would take the legacy even further. His name was Nebuchadnezzar II, and his reign, spanning 43 years from 605 to 562 BCE, would be the most glorious in Babylonian history. Nebuchadnezzar was a master builder, a skilled military leader, and a devout patron of Marduk. Under his rule, Babylon was transformed into a city of dreams, a marvel of ancient engineering and architecture. He rebuilt the city's walls, expanded its palaces, and restored its temples with unmatched splendor. The famous Ishtar Gate, glazed with blue bricks and decorated with lions, dragons, and bulls, stood as a proud symbol of Babylon's return to greatness. But the most legendary structure associated with his reign was the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Though debated by historians, the gardens were described as a lush, terraced paradise, built to mimic the mountainous homeland of his queen, Amadis. Whether myth or reality, they captured the imagination of all who heard of them and cemented Babylon's image as a city of wonder. Militarily, Nebuchadnezzar secured the empire's borders and expanded its influence into Syria, Phoenicia, and even parts of Judah. In 586 BCE, he famously conquered Jerusalem, destroyed Solomon's temple, and exiled much of the Jewish population to Babylon, a moment that would deeply influence Judeo-Christian history and literature. At its height, the Neo-Babylonian Empire was a powerhouse of culture, astronomy, art, and law. Babylonian scholars mapped the stars, created detailed calendars, and advanced mathematics. The city was not just a political capital, it was a cosmic city, the center of the universe in the eyes of its people. But as always in Mesopotamian history, golden ages are fleeting. After Nebuchadnezzar's death, the empire was plagued by weak leadership, infighting, and corruption. His successors lacked his charisma and vision. Internal struggles weakened the once strong state. And in the east, a new power was rising, one more organized, more disciplined, and more ambitious than any before, Persia, under the rule of Cyrus the Great. In 539 BCE, the Neo-Babylonian Empire met its quiet end. Cyrus marched into Babylon without a fight. The city gates were opened peacefully, and the Persian king was welcomed as a liberator. Babylon would remain a great city, but no longer the heart of an empire. Still, the Neo-Babylonian revival left an indelible mark. It proved that memory could be more powerful than force. That even after centuries of humiliation and decline, a culture could rise again, surpass its former glories, and remind the world who it once was. Chapter 16: The Persian Conquest and the Last Echoes of Mesopotamia. By the middle of the 6th century BCE, Babylon stood as the richest city in the known world. Its temples shimmered with gold. Its astronomers tracked the movements of planets. Its priests recited prayers to gods that had been worshipped for thousands of years. But even with all its splendor, Babylon, and with it, Mesopotamia, was no longer the center of power. A new empire, far more expansive, had begun to rise from the east. Persia. Under the leadership of Cyrus II, known to history as Cyrus the Great, the Persians had achieved what no Mesopotamian power had done since the time of Sargon and Hammurabi. They united a vast and diverse collection of peoples under a single rule, one that stretched from the Indus River in the east to the Aegean Sea in the west. Cyrus had conquered the once feared Median Empire, absorbed the powerful kingdom of Lydia, and defeated many local rivals with remarkable speed and minimal destruction. He offered a different kind of kingship, one rooted not in terror, but in tolerance and administration. His approach was revolutionary for the time. He respected local religions, allowed deported peoples to return to their homelands, and presented himself as a liberator rather than a destroyer. So when he turned his attention to Babylon, he didn't need to destroy it. He needed only to walk in. In 539 BCE, the Persian army approached the city. But rather than resist, the Babylonians opened their gates. Some say the priests and aristocrats had grown weary of their corrupt king, Nabonidus, who had alienated the priesthood and disrupted the city's religious traditions. Others believe Cyrus' reputation for mercy and reform won them over before a single arrow was fired. Either way, Babylon fell without a battle. And with it, Mesopotamia became part of a new empire, the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Cyrus entered the city with respect. He performed the traditional rites of Marduk, restored religious practices, and freed captive peoples, including the Jews, who had lived in exile since Nebuchadnezzar's conquest. In doing so, he cemented his rule not as a foreign conqueror, but as a rightful king of Babylon. But while this moment was peaceful, it marked a major turning point. For the first time in thousands of years, Mesopotamia was no longer in charge of its own destiny. It had become a province, important, wealthy, and respected, but no longer sovereign. Cyrus and his successors, Cambyses, Darius, and Xerxes, would continue to govern Babylon as a jewel of their empire. They maintained the temples, preserved the archives, and employed local scribes and administrators. Babylon remained a major cultural and economic hub, even as power shifted further east to Persepolis and Susa. Cuneiform tablets continued to be written. The priests of Asagila, the temple of Marduk, still performed their duties. Farmers still plowed the fields of the Euphrates Valley as they had for generations. But something had changed. The kings no longer wrote hymns to Enlil. They no longer built ziggurats to proclaim their divine favor. Instead, they now ruled from afar, issuing commands in Old Persian, Aramaic, and Elamite. The language of power was changing. The gods of the past were fading. Over the next century, this slow erosion continued. By the time Alexander the Great arrived in 331 BCE, after defeating the Persian king Darius III at the Battle of Gaugamela, Babylon was still a majestic city, but now a relic of a past age. Alexander entered Babylon in triumph and declared himself its new ruler. He paid homage to Marduk, ordered repairs to temples, and made plans to use Babylon as the capital of his global empire. But he would never see that vision fulfilled. Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BCE, at the age of 32. After his death, his empire fractured. Babylon became a contested prize between his generals. As the Seleucid dynasty took over, Greek became the new language of administration. New cities like Seleucia on the Tigris were built nearby, siphoning off commerce and prestige. Over the following centuries, Babylon slowly withered. Temples were neglected. Irrigation canals fell into disrepair. The population declined. Cuneiform, once the lifeblood of administration, law, and literature, became the domain of a shrinking priestly class. By the 1st century CE, the last known cuneiform tablet was written. After over 3,000 years of continuous use, the world's first writing system had fallen silent. Mesopotamia, the land of Eden, of Gilgamesh, of Hammurabi, of Ashurbanipal and Nebuchadnezzar, faded into memory. Its cities turned to ruins, buried under layers of sand, forgotten by the very civilizations it had birthed. But it did not vanish. Its legacy lived on, in the Hebrew Bible, which preserves stories of Babylonian exile and Assyrian terror. In the Greek histories that marveled at Mesopotamian science and astrology. In the very idea of law, kingship, empire, and urban life, all pioneered here. When archaeologists in the 19th century unearthed the clay tablets, the ziggurats, the libraries, and the names of long-dead kings, the world realized something staggering: this was not the story of a forgotten people. It was the foundation of civilization itself. Chapter 17: The Legacy of Knowledge, Writing, Science, and the Scribes of Babylon. Even as its kings fell and its palaces crumbled, Mesopotamia's true legacy refused to fade. Because long after the gods were silenced and the ziggurats abandoned, the scribes kept writing. The scholars kept studying. And from within the walls of temples and schools, something remarkable endured: the birth of knowledge. This land between the rivers didn't just give the world empires. It gave the world ideas, structured, written, calculated ideas, that would influence science, literature, religion, and governance for millennia to come. And it all began with a stylus and a wet slab of clay. Writing in Mesopotamia was more than a tool. It was a revolution. Around 3200 BCE, the first clay tablets were inscribed using pictographs to track grain, livestock, and trade. But over the centuries, these symbols evolved into a complex writing system we now call cuneiform. It was used to record laws, contracts, prayers, medical prescriptions, star charts, poems, and even school exercises. By the time of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, cuneiform had reached its full complexity. Scribes trained for years to master the script, studying in idubas, scribal schools attached to temples or palace courts. These students copied and recopied texts, sometimes hundreds of years old, preserving wisdom across generations. What these scribes recorded reveals a civilization not just obsessed with order, but with understanding the world. In the city of Uruk, we find some of the earliest examples of literature. In Nippur, texts survive that catalog thousands of gods and divine powers. But it was in Babylon that writing became a gateway to science. Let's begin with astronomy. Babylonian scholars were among the first to systematically observe the movements of the stars and planets. For them, the skies were a divine map, but also a predictable one. They noted eclipses, planetary retrogrades, lunar cycles, and seasonal changes. Over time, they developed detailed star catalogs and even calculated celestial orbits with surprising accuracy. By the first millennium BCE, they had devised mathematical models to predict eclipses and planetary positions, centuries before similar advancements in Greece or India. They divided the circle into 360 degrees, invented 60-based, sexagesimal, timekeeping, and laid the groundwork for the very system we use today, 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour. In mathematics, Babylonian scribes developed a positional number system. They calculated square and cube roots. They solved quadratic equations. They recorded algebraic problems involving fields, bricks, and grain. Their math was practical, but also abstract. Some of their tablets even show early versions of Pythagoras' theorem, written centuries before Pythagoras himself was born. In medicine, clay tablets describe symptoms, diagnoses, and treatments, combining empirical observations with religious rituals. A healer might prescribe an herbal mixture for a stomach ailment, but also instruct the patient to pray to a healing god or wear an amulet to drive out spirits. It was a fusion of science and superstition, one that would later influence Egyptian, Greek, and Roman medical traditions. In law and administration, Mesopotamian record-keeping reached a level of bureaucratic complexity rarely matched in the ancient world. Temple economies were tracked with mind-numbing precision. Land sales were recorded with measurements down to the cubit. Wills, marriage contracts, loan agreements, and even letters of complaint have all survived, giving us a rare glimpse into everyday life across thousands of years. But perhaps most beautifully, Mesopotamia gave the world literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh, carved into clay more than 4,000 years ago, is not just the world's first great story, it is still one of its most powerful. It tells the tale of a king who sought eternal life, faced the loss of his closest friend, and journeyed to the ends of the earth to ask the gods why death must exist. The epic confronts grief, love, mortality, and the struggle for meaning in a world beyond human control. It is as relevant today as it was when scribes first etched it into tablets. Mesopotamian literature also includes hymns, wisdom texts, riddles, debates, and even the world's earliest schoolboy essays, some of which complain about unfair teachers and boring assignments, proving that human nature has changed little in 4,000 years. All of this, the science, the poetry, the math, the medicine, was preserved not by kings, but by scribes. By quiet figures working in temple chambers, copying line after line of cuneiform under the flicker of oil lamps. Their efforts ensured that long after empires rose and fell, Mesopotamia's voice would remain. And for centuries, it did. Even under Persian, Greek, and Parthian rule, Babylonian scholarship persisted. Aramaic began to replace Akkadian, but cuneiform did not disappear overnight. Instead, it faded slowly. Generation by generation, fewer scribes learned the script. Fewer temples maintained their libraries. Until one day, it was simply gone. By the time of Christ, no one alive could read the tablets anymore. The ziggurats were crumbling. The names of Enlil, Ishtar, and Nergal were forgotten. Mesopotamia had slipped into myth. But the knowledge waited. Thousands of tablets lay buried in the ruins of cities like Nineveh, Uruk, and Babylon, waiting to be discovered. And in the 19th century, they finally were. Archaeologists unearthed entire libraries, and scholars slowly deciphered the ancient code. A new voice emerged from the dust, whispering of stars, kings, floods, and dreams. The rediscovery of Mesopotamian knowledge changed the modern world. It reminded us that the story of civilization didn't begin with Greece or Rome, but with Sumer and Akkad. With clay and reed. With scribes and stars. Chapter 18, Gods of Dust and Sky, Religion, Myth, and the Birth of Heaven and Hell. Long before the idea of a single god took hold in the hills of Canaan, before the concepts of heaven and hell shaped Western thought, the people of Mesopotamia had already built a world teeming with gods. Not just distant deities, but gods who walked alongside men, demanded respect, showed vengeance, and sometimes, even died. To understand Mesopotamia's religious worldview is to step into a landscape where the divine was woven into the soil, the sky, and the beating heart of every city. Every flood, drought, or harvest wasn't a coincidence. It was a sign. A message. A reaction from the invisible world to the visible one. And at the center of this divine system were the Sumerian and Akkadian gods, a vast and complex pantheon that mirrored the forces of nature, human emotions, and social order. The great god Anu ruled the heavens. He was distant, the sky father who rarely intervened directly but who granted kingship and authority. Below him sat Enlil, god of air, storms, and decision. Enlil was feared. It was he who could send the flood, who could remove kings, and who once banished humanity to destruction when their noise disturbed the gods. Then came Enki, or Ea in Akkadian, god of water, wisdom, and craft. Enki was the trickster and helper, often intervening to save humankind from the wrath of the other gods. It was he who warned the Sumerian Noah, Utnapishtim, of the coming deluge, telling him to build a great boat and survive what was meant to be the end of the human race. Other gods filled out the divine roster: Inanna, Ishtar in Akkadian, the goddess of love, war, and chaos, unpredictable and immensely powerful. Nergal, god of plague and the underworld. Shamash, god of the sun and justice, whose watchful eye saw all human deeds. Nana, the moon god, and Marduk, the patron deity of Babylon who rose to supreme power during the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Every city had its patron god, and the city's fate was seen as a reflection of that god's favor, or disapproval. If a city fell, it meant its god had abandoned it. If a king ruled well, it was because the gods walked with him. But the Mesopotamians did not imagine their gods living in paradise. Their divine realms were like reflections of the human world, messy, hierarchical, and filled with politics, alliances, and betrayals. Myths were not abstract allegories. They were dramas, full of conflict and emotion. One of the most haunting beliefs the Mesopotamians held was their concept of the afterlife. In a world where temples were built tall to reach the heavens, you might expect a glorious vision of life after death. But the Mesopotamians imagined something very different. When a person died, their soul descended into the core, the underworld. It was a dark, dry, and silent realm, not a place of punishment or reward, but of existence without purpose. Here, the dead ate dust and drank muddy water. There were no harps, no fire, no judgment. Just endless silence. The dead remained there unless they were honored by the living. If no one made offerings or remembered them, they faded even further, into nothingness. This bleak view of death wasn't necessarily a sign of pessimism. It reflected the deep Mesopotamian understanding that life itself was sacred, and that meaning must be made here, not in the afterlife. Their myths told stories that would echo through later religions. Inanna's descent into the underworld and return is one of the earliest resurrection stories in human history. Her journey mirrors the seasonal cycle, death and rebirth, darkness and light. When she descended into the realm of her sister, Ereshkigal, the queen of the underworld, she was stripped of her power, killed, and hung on a hook. But with Enki's help, she returned, transformed and more powerful. This myth would later influence Greek stories of Persephone, and perhaps even Christian themes of resurrection. The Epic of Gilgamesh, too, asks a question still central to the human experience: what happens when we die? In his desperate search for immortality after the death of his friend Enkidu, Gilgamesh travels across the world, speaks to the survivors of the flood, and ultimately learns that death is inescapable, even for kings. Sound familiar? Over time, these Mesopotamian religious ideas would travel. They would mix with Canaanite, Persian, and Egyptian beliefs. And through cultural exchange, captivity, and conquest, they would seep into early Judaism, which itself was shaped during the Babylonian exile. The image of a single high god, the concept of divine judgment, the existence of a moral order upheld by supernatural law, all of these found early expressions in Mesopotamian theology. Later, in Christian and Islamic thought, you find remnants of this world, angelic councils that echo the Sumerian divine assemblies, apocalypse narratives that resemble the Mesopotamian flood, even heaven and hell, which evolved from the core and the divine mountain realm of the gods. Mesopotamian religion wasn't static. It changed with the cities, the kings, and the times. But its emotional core, the struggle to understand the forces beyond human control, to appease them, to find peace in a world of chaos, remained constant. And in that struggle, we see the first outlines of the religions that would later define entire civilizations. Chapter 19, The Afterlife of an Empire, How Mesopotamia Shaped the World. Mesopotamia may have faded as an empire, but its influence never truly died. Long after the last ziggurat crumbled and the last cuneiform tablet was written, the ideas born in the land between the rivers continued to echo across continents, civilizations, and centuries. This is the afterlife of an empire, not as ghosts or ruins, but as the living roots of much of the modern world. Let's start with something as basic and revolutionary as writing. The invention of cuneiform in ancient Sumer around 3200 BCE marked the beginning of recorded history. Before that, human memory lasted only as long as the storyteller. With writing, humanity could store knowledge beyond a single lifetime. And though cuneiform itself eventually disappeared, the idea of writing systems, recording contracts, laws, prayers, poems, spread from Mesopotamia to Egypt, to the Levant, and far beyond. Without it, there would be no history books, no literature, no governments as we know them. Even the alphabet that you're reading now traces part of its ancestry back to early Semitic scripts influenced by Mesopotamian systems of record-keeping. But Mesopotamia's impact was far more than just letters on clay. Consider law. Hammurabi's code, written in the 18th century BCE, was one of the first comprehensive legal systems. It established the idea that society should operate under a set of written rules, not just the whims of kings. It dealt with everything from theft and murder to contracts and wages. The laws were displayed publicly. They were designed to unify a diverse population under a shared sense of justice, even if that justice was harsh. This idea, that law can be codified, enforced, and appeal to divine authority, would shape later civilizations from Rome to the modern state. Then there's urban planning and the very concept of cities. Mesopotamia was the birthplace of urban civilization. Cities like Uruk, and Babylon weren't just collections of buildings, they were planned spaces, with administrative centers, marketplaces, religious districts, and housing zones. The idea that people could live in dense, organized communities, governed by institutions rather than just kinship ties, began here. So did the concept of the state, with its officials, taxation, record-keeping, and bureaucracy. Mesopotamian scribes logged grain stored in temples, trade items moving between cities, and labor owed to kings. It was not always efficient, but it was systematic, the earliest form of government infrastructure. From there, we move to time. The way we measure hours, minutes, and seconds today comes directly from the sexagesimal system of the Sumerians and Babylonians. They divided the hour into 60 minutes and the circle into 360 degrees, because they based their math on multiples of 60. This legacy lives in your clock, in geometry, in trigonometry, and in the way we structure calendars. Speaking of calendars, the Babylonians were among the first to systematically study the stars and planets. Their observations led to early astronomy. They predicted eclipses, tracked the lunar cycle, and mapped constellations. The idea that the movements of celestial bodies could be studied to understand time, fate, and even the will of the gods had its earliest roots here. And yes, this scientific inquiry eventually gave rise to astrology, a belief system that would spread to Egypt, Greece, Rome, and the Islamic world, and that still finds a place in modern culture. Let's not forget literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh is not just the world's oldest known epic, it's a blueprint for every hero's journey that came after. A flawed but powerful man loses his closest companion, fears death, and sets out on a journey to find the secret to eternal life. What he discovers is not immortality, but meaning. This story has been echoed, reimagined, and rewritten in thousands of forms, from Homer's Odyssey to medieval tales to modern cinema. Gilgamesh's grief, his questions about life and death, and his search for purpose are universal, and they began on tablets buried in the dust of ancient Uruk. Even religion owes a great debt to Mesopotamia. The concept of divine kingship, the Great Flood, the sacred mountain, the descent to the underworld, and the cosmic struggle between chaos and order, these mythic structures influenced early Judaism, Zoroastrianism, Christianity, and Islam. When the Hebrews were exiled to Babylon, they came into contact with Mesopotamian religious literature. The idea of a flood sent by divine will appears in both the Epic of Gilgamesh and the story of Noah. The Tower of Babel echoes the ziggurats of Babylon. And the Book of Daniel, set in the court of Nebuchadnezzar, directly ties Jewish theology to the politics of the Babylonian court. Later, as the Greek world expanded under Alexander the Great, and as Rome absorbed the knowledge of the East, Mesopotamian science and myth slipped quietly into the background, but remained present, like a foundation buried beneath the floorboards of a house. Even the practice of keeping detailed records, whether in Roman law, Islamic medicine, or Renaissance astronomy, follows a path laid first by the scribes of Sumer and Babylon. So while the Assyrians fell, and Babylon was conquered, and cuneiform faded from memory, Mesopotamia never really died. Its ideas became untraceable origins, things we take for granted today. Cities, laws, contracts, timekeeping, libraries, education, writing, science, prophecy, and story. They all began here. In a land shaped by rivers, ruled by kings, watched by gods, and remembered in clay. Chapter 20, In the Beginning, How Sumer Invented History. Before Babylon's golden gates, before Assyrian armies marched across the known world, before empires rose and fell in waves like the tides of the Euphrates, there was Sumer. A flat land of mud and river water. A land without stone, without metal, without forests. Just silt, wind, and silence. And yet, here, 5,000 years ago, humanity made a choice that would change everything. They stopped wandering. They built. And from that moment, history began. The Sumerians did not call themselves that. They referred to themselves as the black-headed people, and their land as Ki-en-gur, the place of the noble lords. This was not a single kingdom, but a patchwork of independent city-states like Uruk, Lagash, Eridu, and Nippur, each ruled by its own king, each with its own patron god, each competing and cooperating in a delicate, constant dance. Uruk is where it all started. By 3500 BCE, it had grown into the world's first true city. Tens of thousands of people lived within its walls. Canals crisscrossed its districts. Temples soared upward, trying to reach the divine. In the heart of the city, the great Inanna precinct honored the goddess Inanna, a deity of love and war, just as unpredictable as the human condition. In this city, surrounded by clay and driven by the growing demands of urban life, writing was born, not to tell stories at first, but to solve problems. The temples needed to track goods. Farmers needed to record harvests. Merchants needed to log transactions. And so they took reeds, pressed them into wet clay, and began to record reality. First pictographs. Then symbols. Then cuneiform. They had invented the written word, and with it, the first step toward history. But writing wasn't their only invention. The Sumerians created the wheel, not just for carts, but for pottery. They developed mathematics, using base 60 to divide time and space. They invented irrigation systems, channeling the Tigris and Euphrates to turn barren land into fertile grain fields. They formed governments, laws, and bureaucracies. They built ziggurats, tiered temples rising like mountains in a land that had none. And they wrote stories. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest surviving texts in human history, was born here. A tale of a king of Uruk, part god, part man, seeking the meaning of life. He wrestles with power, loss, love, and the terrifying truth of mortality. It's a story so ancient it predates Moses and Homer, but so human, it still speaks to us today. But beyond Gilgamesh, they wrote hymns to the gods. Poems of devotion. Laments for cities lost to war and flood. Wisdom texts teaching how to live, how to lead, and how to die with dignity. The Sumerians gave us the idea that time is not a cycle, but a line. That events could be recorded. That lives could be remembered. That the past could teach us something about the future. In essence, they invented the idea that history matters. And yet, their names were nearly forgotten. Over centuries, the Akkadians absorbed their culture. Their language vanished, replaced by Akkadian, then Aramaic, then Arabic. Their cities were buried under dust, their temples looted, their gods abandoned. For thousands of years, no one knew they had ever existed. Then in the 19th century, archaeologists digging in the sands of Iraq uncovered strange tablets, crumbling ziggurats, and ruins older than Egypt. Piece by piece, the story of Sumer returned, etched into the clay they had once molded, silent for millennia. And in that clay, we found ourselves. We found the beginning of civilization. Of writing. Of law. Of kings. Of time. Of belief. Of story. Sumer was not the end of something. It was the start. The root of everything we call history. We began this journey with the promise that you'd fall asleep to the entire history of ancient Mesopotamia. But if you're still listening, you now know, this wasn't just a timeline. It was a story. Of ambition and collapse. Of gods and kings. Of words and wars. But also, of people. People trying to understand their world, their purpose, their gods, and each other. And it all began in Sumer. Thank you for listening.